Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for having me. I thought I would talk to you today first about the only time in my life anybody ever shot at me. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure, let me let you know that it is not an experience I would care to repeat under any circumstances. Probably what made it worse from my personal standpoint is that they were justified in shooting at me, which is a very awkward situation to be in. I didn't even feel that I was in the right, nor did I have any weapon of any kind on me. So let me just tell you that story very briefly and then connect it to the substantive question I want to discuss with you today, which is the question of what it takes to make a revolution and the two stages in which revolutions must engage and the difference between those two stages. But first, a brief and embarrassing story. I was in Baghdad in Iraq in 2003, about a month at this point after Saddam Hussein's statue had come down, and it was my third day in the country, and I was with a group of MPs and one Judge Advocate General officer driving around Baghdad and checking out some of the mass grave scenes that had been left behind by the fleeing regime of Saddam. Truly horrifying things to see. And on the way back to what was not yet known as the Green Zone, but would shortly be called that, we drove through a very poor, but it seemed friendly Shia section of Baghdad, and I noticed that there was a bakery open. Now, the guys that I was with had been in the desert and then had been on eating MREs, meals ready to eat, these disgusting rations for the previous something like 4 months. And I said, do you guys want some fresh bread? And they said, absolutely. They said, well, should we pull over? And I said, oh, it'll be completely fine. Never say that. We stop, we start chatting, and very quickly a crowd builds up, first of kids and then of adults. And the adults had some hard questions, like, why is there no running water? I said, I don't know. They said, why is there no electricity? I said, I don't know. They said, are you Lebanese? I had an answer for that one. I said, no, I'm American. Why do you think I'm Lebanese? They were like, well, you don't look Iraqi and you can speak Arabic, so you must be Lebanese. So that gave me some sense of the environment I was in. And then came the punchline question, who's the government? And I didn't have an answer for that one either, and that was especially bad. In fact, I had to ask them to repeat the question. Now they thought I was a blithering idiot, Lebanese or otherwise. They said, who is the government? And finally I said to them, well, Ambassador Bremer is the government. He had arrived a day or two before. And they said, who the hell is Ambassador Bremer? I said, well, he was sent by the President of the United States. And they said, well, that's okay, as long as somebody is the government. And it was right at that moment that someone started shooting at us. The kids ran away extremely quickly. They also seemed to know where the bullets were coming from, which was put them one up on me. And I found myself trying to work out whether it would be better to be seen by whoever was shooting at us as though I had a weapon, so that maybe they would go away, or as though I didn't have a weapon, so that maybe they would shoot at somebody other than me. As it turned out, while I was trying to make this decision, we got up and hauled ass. I wish, by the way, that I had a cool image of this to show you, but I was too busy fleeing to take out a camera. Now, in this situation, we were an occupying force, and they were justified, in some sense, whoever they were, in shooting at us. I was with uniformed personnel. I don't mean it was a good thing for them to do. Unfortunately, nobody was hurt in that incident. But their instinct was not an unreasonable one. This was an occupying army in their country, and somebody, and it turned out many, many hundreds of thousands of people, maybe millions, wanted us out and wanted us out right away. The reason that they began to want us out more and more and more with time had everything to do with the revolution question, and everything to do also with the question that I was asked of who is the government. So now let me connect this to the central theme of what I want to discuss in the few minutes that we have. A revolution has two stages. The first stage requires you, and this, by the way, is true of not only political revolutions, but anything that counts as a revolution. First, you have to disrupt the existing order. You have to make a fundamental and meaningful change in how the world is organized in ways that everyone around can see and sense. That's stage one of a revolution. In the Arab Spring, which stands in stark and absolute contrast to the events in Iraq, that first change happened by hundreds of thousands and then millions of people going onto the streets, first in Tunisia, then in Egypt, then across the region, as far away as Bahrain, in Yemen, and of course in Syria, where matters remain unresolved and it took longer for things to get going. That's the first crucial stage. In Iraq, which in the end, ultimately, I will suggest to you probably was not a revolution, the change in the existing order actually happened a different way. It happened because of an invasion. It happened because the United States government bombed the hell out of Iraq, sent its troops, and forced the old regime to leave. In each case, we're talking about the model of a fundamental change in the existing order. The second part of a revolution, however, requires putting in place a new functioning order that is in a meaningful way different from the order that came before. That is the second stage that turns the thing into a revolution proper. And in fact, if all you do is the first, if all you do is fundamentally break the situation that's in existence and do not replace it with anything meaningfully or significantly different and lasting, you have a failed revolution. And eventually people will come to say you didn't have a revolution at all. Now, the reason I was getting shot at in Iraq and the reason people were angry and got angrier over time was that the United States did step one, but the United States did not create the sense of security in Iraq that would have facilitated step two. That's a broad proposition, and there are people who would disagree with it, but I think it's fair. Now, let me contrast that with step two in the Arab Spring. In those countries where the Arab Spring has turned out to be truly revolutionary, and so far only one, Tunisia, definitively counts, although others may follow, people living in the country have to engage now in the serious process of reshaping a new political order that will be fundamentally different than what came before, that will be functional, and that will be sustained. Now, how do you do that? There are lots of ways, but the way that has become most common in our era, and this actually goes back a couple of hundred years, is to try to shape a new constitution, a new constitutional order that will memorialize and put into institutional form the deal that is sealed among the people of the country about how they're going to change the political order. Now, let me say something specific about the difference between the skill sets that is necessary for stage one of the revolution and stage two of the revolution. And let me say that using the example of the Arab Spring. By the way, parenthetically, it's obvious in the US case why the US couldn't do stage two in Iraq. Nobody can arrange a new political order from the outside of a society. I mean, you can force it on people, but they have to adopt it themselves over time. Forcing it would be the examples of the United States and Germany after World War II or Japan after World War II. So if people say, well, you can never successfully impose a constitution, that's not literally true. The United States did so in both Japan and in Germany. But for that to become an actually existing, functioning, long-term blueprint for the society, it has to be adopted by the people who live there, both the people with power and the people without power. So that's why it couldn't happen in Iraq. At least not in the time frame that the United States was there. In the Arab Spring cases, the situation is altogether different. So let's start with the skill set to change the order. This is peaceful revolution, not violent revolution imposed from the outside. Well, I think you're going to hear from some of the next speakers in this particular series more about the extraordinary ways that young people, and especially connected, educated, and in some sense elite young people, went into the streets in the Arab Spring countries, convinced the public that change was possible, and coordinated amongst themselves the extraordinary efforts of people who were extremely brave and went into the streets knowing full well that they would get tear-gassed, shot at, and very well possibly killed. So these were people who were unlike me, who got shot at by accident, were actually brave. People who were choosing to go into the streets knowing that they were going to get shot at. Now, to convince people to do that, you have to have charisma, you have to have organization, and above all else, you have to have imagination. You have to be able to imagine that the world can be different. And you have to be willing to take an enormous risk for that to happen, both individually and collectively. Now, that was an extraordinary thing as it happened in the Arab world. And what happened was that these young leaders inspired lots more people throughout the society so that eventually the people in the streets were not just the educated or the young or people with access to a Twitter account, but broad cross-sections of the society in these different countries. So in Tunisia, you saw labor unions. In Egypt, you saw an enormous cross-section of society. That was stage one. As it turned out, even that was not necessarily enough fully to displace the governments, because the governments, as we see in Syria today, turned to their militaries and said, shut it down. And as we see in Syria, I mean, the game is not over there. It's not a game. It's a life or death situation. The process is not over there. But it can work. It can be possible to repress people if you're willing to kill enough of them. In Tunisia and then again in Egypt, the militaries refused to enforce the will of the presidents. And the very next day in each case, the presidents, Mubarak in Egypt and Ben Ali in Tunisia, fled. So credit for what was accomplished there lies overwhelmingly with the people who went into the streets, but notice that the mechanism whereby the first stage of revolution took place was not the mechanism of literal overthrow. It was convincing the military that it was not a good idea to back the dictators, and in fact, a better idea to back whatever the new order would be. So extraordinary accomplishment, distinctive skill set. Then an extraordinary thing happened that I think is almost unprecedented in the history of revolutions. Now, what happens usually between stage one and stage two of a revolution? Well, the people who made stage one would like to reshape the world in a lasting way according to stage two. Right? They usually call themselves a revolutionary vanguard. And what does the revolutionary vanguard do to give itself a chance to create a new world? It starts ordering people around. It justifies that usually on the grounds that we're in an extraordinary new situation. Things are changing very fast. We're going to be in charge here. You can see this in the case of the Egyptian military, incidentally, which talks this way. They didn't make the revolution, but they still say that things are unstable and uncertain, and you really need us. In any case, most revolutions entail the group of people who made stage one trying to make stage two happen. This revolutionary situation was extraordinary because the people who did stage one believed in democracy. Now, it's beyond the time that I have today to say whether this was a good idea on their part or a bad idea on their part, but you can think about that for yourselves. What this revolutionary group did is they put themselves up for election almost immediately. They created national elections, and immediately they were almost all swept out of office. So if you can imagine the sort of classic communist revolutionary vanguard, they couldn't contain their laughter at this situation. You made a revolution, and now you put yourself up for election, and you're immediately voted out of office. And what's more, they probably knew on some level they would be voted out of office. Because in every single Arabic-speaking country where there's been a free election since 1990, Islamic Democrats, people who are focused on religion and democracy, have won. And that is exactly what happened in parliamentary elections in Egypt. It is exactly what happened in the parliamentary elections in Tunisia. And what it meant was that the class of people who had made the revolution were gone from the political scene, at least in terms of occupying office in the senior political positions. They're still there. They represent minority parties, or some of them are in coalition with Islamic parties, as one sees, for example, in Tunisia. But for the most part, and I think I want to emphasize this point, and if you only take away one thing from what I've said here, which I hope it's this, by putting themselves up for election, the stage two revolutionaries abolished their own political authority. And that is either the most admirable thing I've ever heard of in the history of revolutions or the craziest. It all depends on what happens now in stage two. In stage two, the people who are going to have the opportunity to shape a new functioning order are mostly people who are themselves engaged in a unique historical undertaking of trying to reconcile Islamic values, drawn in part from Sharia, classical Islamic law, with Western democratic institutions that will no longer be Western as they are oriented to and made to exist in majority Muslim countries. There's nothing inherently Western about democracy. India, when I last checked, is not a Western country, and it is the largest and among the better functioning democratic countries in the world. So democracy can adapt, adjust, and be moved from place to place, and it can be made to be reconciled with different worldviews. But it will be altogether original if the Islamic Democrats elected in Tunisia and now governing there, or the Islamic Democrats in Egypt, who hope to have an opportunity to govern, it remains complex because of their relationship with the military, can actually successfully shape in this stage two process a real and meaningful political order that solves the structural and economic problems in their societies, that solves the political balance question in which the fact that these countries have suffered under dictatorship is resolved by the existence of institutions that balance each other. That is to say, a legislature, a court system, an executive branch, administrators, and yes, religious authorities too, not perhaps holding formal jobs, but offering some sort of a moral bulwark against which societal affairs can progress. Now, it is much too soon to say that they will succeed. But what is remarkable is that the skill set that they have is so strikingly disparate and different, divergent from the skill set possessed by the stage one revolutionaries. They are good at grassroots organization, drawing people into ordinary political practices, convincing them that they have the values and ideals that will sustain the society over time, and doing all of this in real time. This is not everyone get together, let's have a protest. This is, let's reorganize our society and draft a new constitution that will enable us to govern according to new principles. This is iterative, repeated over months, not days. This is ideological. It requires people to have beliefs about the right way to be governed. It is institutional. It requires the building of lasting and enduring institutions that have to actually work. And it is above all else boring. It's not charismatic. Sure, you can be charismatic in this process, but that's not in any way, shape, or form a guide to winning. It's good to have good ideas, but one striking feature of the Islamist movements as they exist in Tunisia and Egypt is that they do not have charismatic, remarkable, impressive people at the top. They have ideas that carry charisma, and they have above all else the idea of Islam, which is a tremendously rich, powerful, and charismatic idea. But they're not dependent on charismatic leadership. They're also, by the way, at least so far, not very technologically wired. The technologies that we've seen being so effective at stage one, organizing people to do something rapidly, have not, as of yet, been very effective at stage two. But that's itself a topic for another talk. So if I could leave you with a central message here about the nature of revolutions, it's that revolutionary efforts that clear the table but don't create something new ultimately fail. That the only way that a revolution can ultimately succeed is if the boring, practical, institutional work of shaping new institutions can happen. And ultimately, the public in a given country has to believe that the system that they have is legitimate, effective, and capable of working. Thank you very much.